meant to mention that connected with our associate pastor, Judy, who many of you know had quite a fall a month ago or so. Wow, it's been that long. Almost 6 weeks ago, and broke her elbow and her pelvis. And she said, I said, anything to report to the congregation? And she said, I've gone up the stairs and slept the last 3 nights in my bed. So we celebrate that. That is obviously she is really improving and doing better. And I mentioned to her, it's poignant and hard to enter into this week as a ministry team without her by our side. We are feeling that and continuing to pray for her recovery. So I would encourage you to do the same. There are a lot of people that we need to be praying for these days, as is evident in our prayer list. So do so over the course of your Holy Week. It's a good way to enter into Holy Week in a deeper way, is to take on a new level of prayerfulness for the people in your lives. So 6 weeks ago, we began our Lenten journey and found Jesus in the wilderness, right after his baptism, being tempted by the devil. Over the course of these 6 weeks, we have considered in worship the particular temptations known as the 7 deadly sins. 7 ways that we human beings become curved in on ourselves, separated from God and from one another. The devil does his best to turn Jesus in on himself during those 40 days to make his own safety, preservation, power, prestige preeminent in Jesus' mind. But at each step along the way, Jesus turns the devil away and centers himself back in God. So the gospel writer ends that passage of Jesus in the desert saying, the devil left him until a more opportune time. And that's the nature of these deadly sins. If they are not overtly impacting our thoughts and our choices, then they are lying wait somewhere underground in the background of our lives for an opportune time to assert themselves again, turn us once more away from God, whether that's by way of our becoming a little too greedy for what we are due, or envious of what another has, or overly angry about a perceived injustice, or using another for our own pleasure or whim, and so on and so forth. But why? Why do we get so far off the mark? All of us in some form or another. It's a question worth asking, even if we humans have been asking it from the beginning of human consciousness. In fact, the religions of the world have arisen in part to answer this question. Why the struggle of it? Why evil? Why suffering? If the deadly sins ultimately lead to our own isolation and curvature and suffering, and does damage to the people around us, then why in the world are we tempted towards them? The more opportune time for the temptation towards sin probably came the next day even for Jesus, and often throughout his years of public ministry. But never was it so on display as when he entered Jerusalem for the last time before his passion and his death. This time, entering Jerusalem, it wasn't a temptation towards greed for creature comforts of this world, though it could have been, or stuffing himself gluttonously to try and fill the emptiness that sits in the human soul, though it could have been. It wasn't a temptation towards busy work or pleasure in an effort to avoid the more important work of love, as it could have been. But this time, are you ready for this? Our last couple of sins in the series. This time, Jesus was tempted by the deadly sins of pride and vainglory. Now, if you're paying attention throughout this series, you should be saying, hold up, stop right there, wait a minute. You've been saying all along that there are 7 deadly sins. You did greed and gluttony on the first Sunday, anger on the second, sloth on the third, envy on the fourth. Last week you did lust. And I come to church this morning taking a deep breath to listen to you speak about one more sin which makes 7 and then we're done. And now you're laying 8 on us? The 8 deadly sins? All right, yes, I'm sorry. But the early desert dwellers who developed this list did actually come up with 8 or even 9 sins. It's developed over the decades and centuries to be a list of 7 that still incorporates the 8 or 9 that they came up with. And there's different people have different perspectives on what should be on the list, but these 7 are primary. And if you remember the image of the tree that the choir sang about, the poisonous tree, and I gave and then explained it in week 2. And if you remember, the tree says there are 7 branches representing each sin, and the trunk of the tree is what? Pride. That makes 8 altogether. Sorry. Some people have put deception and lying on as a 9th. Other people have exchanged one or the other for fear. So fear and deception, but the way that certain others explain the list of 7 is that those play into every single sin. Fear and deception and lying play into envy, greed, gluttony, lust, etc., etc. So, I promise once you hear more about the 7th branch, you'll realize just how important it is not to leave it off of the list, even if it's a word that has fallen out of use for the most part for some reason. It has. I'm not sure why. But the 7th sin is the sin of vainglory. Vainglory. The inordinate human desire to be seen, appreciated, acknowledged, recognized, approved of, etc., etc. Uh-oh. I can see that some of you have been saying, I don't really have an issue with the sin of lust much, or I'm not all that envious as to lead down a deadly path, or I don't have that much issue with anger, but I can see you're saying now, I did not see this one coming. That's not how I planned it, and maybe I'm just projecting onto you, which likely I am, because for me as a minister, getting up here in front of you every Sunday and really wanting you to like me and approve of what I'm doing as the lead pastor of your church and recognize how hard I have been working for you and have you appreciate me. This one sends me personally out of this series with a bang. Vainglory. As we've been saying all along with all of these sins, the natural desire that this sin arises out of is not a bad. Just as sex is a beautiful thing and lust is the distortion of it, the desire for affirmation and approval is a natural part of us, a critical part of our developing into mature, relatively independent human beings. It's critical. But there comes a crossover point when the desire becomes distorted in our lives and the love and attention that maybe we needed from our parents but never got becomes a lifelong project of trying to fill the sense of unworthiness within us with the praise and affirmation and approval of others. Or we don't have to blame our parents for that necessarily. Maybe we need to give our parents a break. For whatever reason, there can grow, and in many of us, if not most of us, there can grow within a great gaping maw of emptiness out of which the sin of vainglory reaches to get the approval and the praise and the glory from others so that we can feel some sense that we are okay. Why is it a sin? Because that grasping comes at the expense of truth sometimes, at the expense of honesty, at the expense of care for others, at the expense of our devotion to God. So vainglory is different from the trunk of the tree pride, and why we're not giving a separate Sunday to pride, which we can if there's an outcry. We need pride, we need pride. We can do that, but is because each Sunday along the way, all 6 Sundays, we've referenced pride and shown how pride has connected to each of the deadly sins. So pride is thinking too highly of one, to make the distinction between pride and vainglory. Pride is thinking too highly of oneself, while vainglory is desiring that others think highly of you. Pride says, I think I'm someone great. Vainglory says, I want you to think I'm someone great. People beset by the sin of pride want to be someone great, number one, no matter the cost to self or others, while vainglorious people don't care whether they are actually great or not, they just want everybody else to think they are. I'm not sure if anyone pops to mind around you, but you're not supposed to go there. Right? This is about ourselves, so let's see. They just want to think they are. So you get the distinction. So here are some of the ways that the pride trunk branches out to vainglory, which branches out to so many other sins. So we may do something wrong or something not so good because we want to get the attention of a particular group of people. That's a vainglorious action. We might sacrifice the truth in order to get the attention or the praise or the popularity that we want. We may work harder for the impression we are making than for the integrity of our work. We might work on building our reputation with trivial things, while deeper, more important, and less noticeable efforts are really needed. And that's where vainglory and sloth can become conjoined, as we can be working so hard and so busy at things that make us look good, when really the work that needs to be done is deeper, harder work, maybe without recognition involved, right? That's the definition of the deadly sin of sloth. Not necessarily laziness, but working hard to avoid the deeper work that is needed. Gossip. Gossip is an offspring of the branch of vainglory. If we speak badly of others to make ourselves look good, or so others like us or think we are funny or entertaining, that is the sin of vainglory. There's the insidious temptation within vainglory to do good more for the kudos we get than what is truly needed for the other. And then hypocrisy is also this deadly sin's offspring. And if there's one thing that Jesus cannot stand, in the Gospels, it is the hypocritical, right? Those who say one thing for appearance or reputation or approval's sake and then do another behind the scenes. That's what he's constantly coming up against the Pharisees and scribes about. And the list of vainglorious breaking branches of sin continue. It is rooted, though, in the trunk of pride, in that ultimately vainglory is a denial of God, which all the sins on the poison tree are. Vainglory resists our resting in the arms of our Creator, and instead sets us to finding our own worth and our own value from others who are lesser than God. It's a very sad sin. It's sad in many ways because it is the sin of those who are convinced deep down that they will never be good enough to shine without artificial lighting and extra polish, as Rebecca DeYoung puts it in her Glittering Vices book. It is the sin of those who are faking it because they never believe they will ultimately make it. And the promise of God is that you are ultimately beloved. That is the final say here. You are beloved and will make it into my heart, no matter what. But vainglory keeps us grasping for our own sense of what it means to make it. Rebecca DeYoung gives this, what I find is a beautiful example of the difference between giving glory to God and seeking glory for oneself in this particular sin. And she says this, I'll quote her in full, but I'm adapting it a little bit. She says, "When I think back on the birth of our children, the greatest blessings my husband and I have been given, I think our delivery room reaction was probably right on target. In the moments after the birth, we were simply awash in waves of profoundest gratitude and overwhelmed by the wonder of the tiny bundle that lay in our arms. For that moment, at least, we breathed our glorias in hushed tones." That frame of mind contrasts sharply with the parade of Facebook postings and Instagram portraits and conversations around whose children are going to the best schools and have the most accomplishments, where vainglory whispers suggestions in our ears about how they reflect our own glory, as if that is really to our credit anyway. She says, "The amazing goodness of a child, the beauty of a child, points one to the giver of all perfect gifts in the first place, while in the second, the gift is used merely to put oneself in the spotlight." That's vainglory, seeking glory for ourselves, whatever the cost. And its countervailing virtue is giving God the glory where the glory is due. Did you know that Johann Sebastian Bach was known not only for writing beautiful cantatas and organ music, but also for writing on every manuscript the words "Soli Deo Gloria"? To God alone be the glory. On every manuscript. Everything, even our own gifts and accomplishments and victories, whether large or small, should ultimately point us and the people around us back to God. How great and merciful and creative and amazing God is. Both pride and vainglory fail that. When Jesus came into Jerusalem, he was riding on a donkey, a colt, a symbol of peace and a symbol of humility. Biblical historians like Marcus Borg and John Crossan have explained that while Jesus was coming into Jerusalem through the east gate, or the back gate for Passover, likely Pilate was on his great horse and his grand entourage was coming through the west gate, the front gate, with all the pomp and circumstance and vainglory that accompanied him. And on both sides, cheers were lifted, coats laid down, and branches spread. What a temptation it was for Jesus to enter with shouts of Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Right? The phrase for the offered by Jews for the Messiah. Jesus was aware, we imagine, of what he was facing as he entered Jerusalem and how fleeting the shouts and praises would be. He would be following God's purposes for him, and very quickly he would become very unpopular because he wasn't going to give the people what they wanted, or at least what they thought they wanted. He could have so easily turned aside from the path God was calling him down to please the people around him. What a temptation that must have been throughout his ministry, to please others other than God, to make them impressed with him, to make them admire him, to be amazed by him. He could have convinced himself that there was still more good he could do if he walked away and started a community of followers out in the desert. He would have been great at that and loved that and found such satisfaction in that. Why can't that be for me? But he rode on that donkey as the praises and accolades and glories burst around him, right on through his own temptation towards vainglory and to the temple where the shouts became angry as he overturned the tables, was arrested, and eventually executed. Thankfully, on Jesus' very soul was stamped the phrase, Soli Deo Gloria, to God alone be the glory. Nothing less could have seen him through. Nothing less could have saved us, poor people curved in on ourselves. But Jesus was able to reveal us as beloved children of God nonetheless, and reveal God as ultimately love. So to end this series and this sermon, I come back to the question of why. Why is there this tendency towards curvature in on ourselves through greed, gluttony, anger, sloth, envy, lust, vainglory, and pride, even though they cause us and everyone around us so much pain and sorrow? The Episcopal priest William Stafford asks this in his book, Disordered Loves. He says, why do we shy away from God? God is infinite light and goodness. Why do we refuse him? Why prefer derivative lights and secondary goods? Why do we choose darkness and evil when one might live with the source of all that is good? Why do we flee God, he asks. There are, of course, any number of answers to this that breed more questions, and tomes have been written to address it. Father Stafford suggests, and makes an interesting suggestion, particularly in light of the discovery, the picture this week of the black hole. Unreal. He says that we live on this knife's edge between the abyss of non-being and the abyss of God. The black hole of non-being and the abyss of God. He says on this edge we lean back towards the black hole of non-being as pride swells up to make ourselves something of God. Or in the case of sloth, we shrink down to give up all hope or to busy ourselves with the tedium of life and ignore our high calling as children of God, and we lean back towards that hole. The glory of the abyss of God over here is too much for us to handle. So we go towards that which is quicker, easier, more palatable for us to manage or something. And then we also have seen what happens at times to those who do follow God's call of love in a world with quite a bit of hate. We've seen Jesus strung up on the cross and Stephen stoned to death and Catherine of Alexandria executed and Edith Stein sent to the gas chambers and Martin Luther King shot. Each of them and so many others followed love's demands and paid for it. For all of them, there were certainly paths that vainglory must have beckoned them down, or that sloth would lure them to, or greed would have enticed them towards, or anger would have tempted them. And how often would they fall? But somehow the call was greater than their well-being, their physical well-being, their soul greater than their egos and their self-preservation somehow. So there's a word equally as outdated for some reason as vainglory, and that is the counterbalance to this deadly sin, and that word is magnanimity. To be magnanimous, right? The two parts of the word magna animus, to be great-souled. Magnanimous people, as this term has been defined, are those who concern themselves with achieving great and hard-won acts of virtue as something to which God has called them. Those given to achieving great and hard-won acts of virtue as something to which God has called them, magnanimous. To counteract vainglory, we ask, what is God calling me to, however humble and behind the scenes, out of the eyes of the world it might be? And then to stick doggedly to that call out of our love for God and our commitment to this life. Ultimately, as with all of these sins, if we feel the weight of them, we can pray this simple prayer to the one who loves us. And it's adapted from the psalmist. Say, "Search me, O God, and see if there is any vainglory in me." And maybe we can take a different sin each time we sit for prayer. Search me, O God, and see if there is any envy in me, any greed, any lust, any anger. And then allow God, who is love, to teach us and lead us through them towards course correction one more time. One more time. And it's going to be one more time, over and over again. Search me, O God, and see if there is any sin within me. May you find that Jesus, our guide and our Savior, will be there for you, right there at those difficult points of curvature, not to condemn and judge you, but to take your hand and lead you along the way to help you take up your cross and follow for love's sake.